Welcome to Lesson 5. Today we will be looking at something a little bit different than the first 4 lessons. It's the autobiography of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein might be a familiar name, or you might be just familiar with Einstein. That's because he's one of the most famous scientists of modern times. He's a physicist, and today we're going to not so much look at his science, but his autobiography, which is his childhood. He's talking about when he was your age and what his thinking was, how he developed into the person or the famous scientist that he became. So I hope you find it interesting and a little bit different from the religion and politics and constitution and things we've been looking at before. Before we get to the autobiography, we're going to look at a song. We'll start with a song lyric, and as always, there's a missing word. To guess this missing word, you need to think about what's the topic of today's lesson. You can see in the title, there's a blank, and then in the lyrics of the song, there's also a blank. Let's look at the lyrics for a second, and then you'll listen to the song and see if you can guess what's the missing word. There's 2 reasons I picked this song. One is that it is about, or the topic of the song is about something that relates to Einstein. And then if you look at the lyrics I think are pretty simple, especially compared to some of the songs we've looked at before. It's by a band called Coldplay, a British band. And if you look at the beginning, come up to meet me, tell you I'm sorry, you don't know how lovely you are. So it sounds like a love song. The interesting thing, and when you look at the video, you'll see this more clearly, is this song is also about time. So if you go through the lyrics, it keeps repeating, oh, let's go back to the start. Running in circles, coming up tails, heads on a blank apart. So we'll look at the missing word there. The missing word, like I said, is the key to the lesson today, the main topic of the lesson today. But it also is interesting because a couple years ago, it was Einstein's 100th birthday, if he was still alive. It would have been his 100th birthday. And it, he besides his theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, a famous equation, which I have no idea what that means, but I know it's famous. He also discovered that time is not straight. Time dips, it curves according to gravity. And so it's a very complicated concept that I can't explain clearly, but you can think about that too as we listen to the song lyric. So let's go ahead and listen to the blank by Coldplay and see if you can figure out the word that's missing.
Come up to meet you, tell you I'm sorry, you don't know how lovely you are. I had to find you, tell you I need you, tell you I set you apart. Tell me your secrets and ask me your questions. Now let's go back to the start. Running in circles, coming in tails, heads on the sides apart. Nobody said it was easy. It's such a shame for us to part. Nobody said it was easy. No one ever said it would be this hard. Oh, take me back to the start.
So I hope you enjoyed that video. You could see that the lead singer of the band Coldplay was doing almost everything in the reverse. If you look at the video closely though, there's a few little tricky things in there that I find pretty interesting when I see the video, so it's worth looking at more than once. Well, that's our warm-up exercise. Let's go ahead and start looking at Einstein's Autobiography. Like I mentioned already, this is a fairly difficult text. Einstein was a very smart man, and so he used lots of big words. It was interesting to me to see what a scientist was thinking about when he was a teenager. That's why I thought maybe some of you would be interested in this, because I know a lot of you do like science. So let's just go to the beginning. There's a lot of vocabulary, but we'll go to start from the first paragraph and look at it a bit and analyze it. So he starts this section by saying, "When I was a fairly precocious young man, I became thoroughly impressed with the futility of the hopes and strivings that chased most men restlessly through life." Okay, this is a hard sentence, but I think a very interesting sentence. So there's a lot of adjectives, descriptive words, like precocious. That's a hard vocabulary word. Maybe the first time you've heard this word. Precocious means when a child is very smart, we call them precocious. So Einstein, most people, if they said, "I'm precocious," is kind of bragging. It doesn't sound too good, but we figure this is Einstein speaking, so Einstein has the right to say he was a smart young man. So he calls himself a fairly precocious. He's a little humble because he says fairly precocious. Fairly is an adverb, so not something like 100% precocious or tremendously precocious. He does say fairly precocious. So he describes himself as a very bright young man. I became thoroughly impressed. So impressed, impression, it made a strong impression on him. Remember, this is his memories of his childhood, with the futility of the hopes and strivings that chase most men restlessly through life. Futility comes from the word futile, which means useless. If you look at futility, the opposite of futility, you take away the F, is utility, useful. Futile is useless. Usable or useful is the opposite of that. So the futility of the hopes and strivings. So hopes is a pretty common word. I hope this will happen. I hope you will learn this lesson very well. Strivings. Strivings is when you are trying very hard to do something. All of you are striving to learn English now. So he said he was impressed with the futility of the hopes and strivings. So this doesn't mean he was thinking these hopes and strivings were going well for most men. He said they were futile, they were useless. These useless strivings of most men restlessly through life. So I'm chuckling because to me the meaning of this sentence is kind of like most people waste their lives. They strive for these things that are useless. And so this is already a fairly challenging opening sentence. When I read this, I said, oh, this is not a conventional or a normal person's view. He's not going to say all nice, cheery things about mankind. He's pretty critical. Moreover, I soon discovered the cruelty of that chase. So not only are the things that people chase useless, he also says they're cruel, the cruelty of that chase. The word chase here means to run after something. So he says it's a futile chase and it's a cruel chase. Remember, Einstein was born in Germany, and he and his family had to move out of Germany because of Hitler. So he probably, in his growing up, I can say pretty much for sure, had relatives that were injured or killed in the Holocaust. He probably had a fairly difficult childhood, as most people who were refugees during World War II. A lot of them came to Shanghai too, for that matter, but Einstein and his family ended up going to the US. So that might give you a little context about what he's talking about. Moreover, I soon discovered the cruelty of that chase, which in those years was much more carefully covered up by hypocrisy and glittering words than is the case today. So, hypocrisy, hypocrite, that's someone who says something that they don't believe or they don't actually do themselves. If you're a hypocrite, it means you say, I am very nice to dogs, but then you go and you kick a dog. That would make you a hypocrite. You're not nice to dogs, you kicked a dog. So he's talking about the hypocrisy and glittering words that people said back then. So people said things and said this is what life is all about, but he called them hypocrites. The hypocrisy. They said you should do this, but they weren't even doing it themselves. They were fake, which in those years was much more carefully covered up by hypocrisy and glittering words than is the case today. So the case here is kind of like the situation. So he thought then that when he was growing up, there were more hypocrites. It was even worse than when he was a grown man writing this book. I probably, if I challenged you to find adults, leaders, people who are hypocrites, you could probably find some examples around the world. I know I could. In my own country, the U.S., U.S. citizens in a democracy, we love to call our leaders hypocrites or call them out if they do something hypocritical. By the mere existence of his stomach, everyone was condemned to participate in that chase. By the mere, we've had the word mere before. This is a repeating word. Mere means kind of like only. It's a little bit hard to explain, but you have to look at it in the whole sentence. The mere existence of his stomach. What does that mean? So your stomach exists. Think for a minute. What is he saying here? Everyone is condemned. Condemned means you have to do something you don't want to do to participate in the chase. So he keeps talking about this chase, which is basically what he thinks. Sometimes we could say a rat race, when humans go through life chasing some goal. I'm sure you, in your lives as students, can have a feeling for what it's like to chase goals when you don't always know if it's a worthwhile goal to chase. So he says, by the mere existence of his stomach. Think about what that means. Why would your stomach make you have to chase what he calls a futile and cruel goal? I interpret that to mean people have to eat. So to keep from starving, to keep food on the table, you run through life in this cruel chase. The stomach might well be satisfied by such participation, but not man, insofar as he is thinking and feeling being. So maybe your stomach's full, according to Einstein, but your thinking might not be satisfied. So we've looked at religion, we've looked at Christianity. This is, you'll especially see in the next paragraph, this is definitely Einstein talking about his spiritual awakening as a young man. So we'll go to the next paragraph and see a little bit more specific information about that. As the first way out, there was religion, which is implanted into every child by way of the traditional education machine. I'm laughing again. When I read those words, since I'm an educator, I can't help but laugh, because he didn't have fond things to say about schools like ours. He called it an education machine, where you're part of a machine, you're a cog in a machine. So it's not really a flattering way to describe education. And he says it's implanted in every child. Implanted, you know the word plant. Plant something in the ground, plant a seed. He almost makes it sound like brainwashing. And he's referring to religion. So he's not like Martin Luther King, who we looked at last lesson, who was inspired by religion and thought religion would bring people to a better way of life. Einstein's talking about religion as something that's planted in their brains through the education machine, traditional education machine. So not very nice way of describing religion. We'll go on. Thus I came, though the child of entirely irreligious Jewish parents. So irreligious means not religious. Religious, religion, the opposite is irreligious. If you say, more often we use the word, if you don't believe in God, I say I'm an atheist. You can be an agnostic, which means you're not sure or you question whether God exists, but you're not willing to say, I don't believe in God. Irreligious Jewish parents means parents that were not religious, but he was culturally Jewish. That's why I mentioned he was left Germany during World War II. To a deep religiousness, which however reached an abrupt end at the age of 12. So his parents weren't religious, but in his childhood he first had a deep religiousness. He's already told us that the education machine implanted this in his brain, which however reached an abrupt, A-B-R-U-P-T, abrupt, it's kind of like the word interrupt, rupture, R-U-P-T, rupt, this root means break. So abrupt means a sudden break, abrupt end at the age of 12. So he was religious up until age 12. So how old are you? I think a lot of you might be 13, 14. So Einstein was religious up until age 12. So he, as a young child, he said he was precocious, and it sounds like it. He was thinking fairly deeply about things. This is Einstein as an adult, thinking back to himself as a child, but he was definitely thinking fairly deeply about things. Through the reading of popular scientific books, I soon reached the conviction that much in the stories of the Bible could not be true. Okay, so this is a very clear sentence where he stakes his claim. He believes in science. And if you read the Bible, we read a little piece of the Bible called the Sermon on the Mount, but if you read the Bible, a lot of the stories are kind of crazy. Like they're miracles. They're things that people are never likely to see in their lifetimes. So Einstein decided, once he understood science, many things like God created the earth in 6 days, and the seventh day he rested. All those things that are in the Bible, scientifically he said, no, that's impossible. There are things like they're discovering dinosaur bones, and they could date them back much longer than the history of the Bible. The Bible goes back a few thousand years and doesn't mention dinosaurs, but talks about the beginning of the earth, that type of thing. So according to science, the stories of the Bible could not be true. That was young Einstein's conclusion. The consequence was a positively fanatic orgy of free thinking, coupled with the impression that youth is intentionally being deceived by the state through lies. It was a crushing impression. Okay, so if you read this and take Einstein's words to heart, you might become more rebellious or more questioning of the things that adults, including teachers, government leaders, maybe even parents tell you. So he said the consequence, remember, means result, was a positively fanatic orgy of free thinking. So he could have just said a lot of free thinking. His mind exploded with ideas. It became very free. Once he threw away religion, he could think about anything. He didn't have to narrow his point of view or explanation for why things happened. But he uses a very interesting phrase, positively fanatic. You might know the word fan. I'm a fan of this singer. I'm a fan of Beyonce. Fanatic is the long version of the word fan. But the word orgy is a little bit interesting. I won't tell you. It's got a really dirty meaning. If you want to find out that meaning, you can go look up in the dictionary. Here, orgy means just craziness, just out of control. A fanatic orgy of free thinking, coupled with the impression that youth is intentionally being deceived by the state. It was a crushing impression. So impression is the third time he's used the word impression. So get this word impression. He's talking about his impression as a young man. So youth, as he thinks that the state, the key word here to understand this part of the sentence is deceived by the state. What is the state? We have the United States of America, but in this way, when the state is a small s, it means the government, the country. So he's basically saying that he was being deceived, or not he, but all of youth, young people, were intentionally, on purpose, being deceived by the state. So you could go back and look at what was the government and his teacher saying to him back then. Maybe it applies to our times now, maybe it doesn't. You can think for your own on that. Intentionally being deceived by the state. So the state, the government, was lying to him. And through the lies, it was a crushing impression. So it crushed him. It made such a strong impression on him. So the interesting thing to me, many interesting things when you read this autobiography, is you think about what Einstein went on to accomplish, and then how he was thinking as a young man and where he got in his life. The fanatic orgy of free thinking was probably responsible for him being able to have the inventions and ideas that he had. So let's go a little bit further. I'm not going to dissect the whole thing with you. You can always look at it yourself and ask me questions. But we'll go to the fourth paragraph. And the fourth paragraph is one sentence. He wrote very long sentences. You'll see a lot of his paragraphs. So the paragraph we just read was actually just 2 sentences. So sometimes these long sentences are confusing. You have to get back to grammar. What's the subject of the sentence? What's the verb of the sentence, like we did with the preamble of the Constitution last time? So the fourth paragraph says, mistrust of every kind of authority grew out of this experience. A skeptical attitude toward the convictions that were alive in any specific social environment, an attitude that has never again left me, even though later on it has been tempered by a better insight into the causal connections. I read causal, I almost said casual. Actually, if you change the S and the U in the word causal, it looks like casual. So you have to read a little carefully. Easy mistake to make, even for me, even though I've been reading for many, many years. So let's go back to the beginning, mistrust. So we said irreligious in the second paragraph is the opposite of religious. Mistrust is the opposite of trust. Do you trust me as your teacher, or do you mistrust me? If I was Einstein's teacher, would he trust me or would he mistrust me? I don't know. Mistrust of every kind of authority. Probably he would mistrust me. He said of every kind of authority, a teacher is authority, grew out of this experience. So any kind of authority, your teacher, your government, your parents, he was probably a difficult child to raise. A skeptical attitude toward the convictions that were alive in any specific social environment. So he questioned. Convictions means strong beliefs. I have a conviction that men are good. That's a strong belief. Some people have a conviction that men are basically evil and they need religion to make them good. So different people have different convictions. Conviction has a second meaning, which is you go to jail, you're convicted of a crime. We looked at a few of those kind of words last lesson that have 2 meanings. So here convictions mean strong belief, but conviction can also mean found guilty of a crime. So you just have to look at the sentence, the context, to know which meaning of conviction is this. So attitude towards convictions that were alive in any specific social environment, an attitude that has never left me again, even though later on it has been tempered by a better insight into the causal connections. I almost said the wrong pronunciation again. Here a key word, so he still is skeptical. Way back in the beginning of the class, I named the class Yale Power Reading, partly because it was PR, Maybe you'd be more attracted to the class if I used the word Yale. But also, I did mention that Yale, their big maybe thing they try to do is think like Einstein. They like to be skeptical. They like to question everything. That was the one thing I noticed in every class I was in there. They were always picking everything apart, picking ideas apart, arguing, that type of thing. A skeptical attitude. So I've actually asked you to have a skeptical attitude of everything I say, everything you learn, question it. That's what a skeptical attitude means. If you have a rosy attitude, a happy attitude, maybe you accept everything people tell you. Einstein was not like that. He said he has a skeptical attitude, but it was tempered when he got older. Tempered means to, temper is one of those words that has a lot of different meanings too. Here it means controlled, calmed down. It was tempered by a better insight. You have a bad temper, that's you get angry easy. So this is a word that can kind of have an opposite meaning in a different situation. But here tempered means, it's more like tempered steel is the origin, where you do things to make steel more flexible. So tempered by a better insight into causal connections. So once he understood the causes of things, causal connections is what makes things happen, he got a little less extremely, he stopped his orgy of skepticism and could calm it down a little bit, because he understood why people think the way they do. Okay, so there's a lot of deep ideas here, and we only have 2 more paragraphs, but I won't get into them now. I always like to leave you guys a couple parts where you can think your own, because as I interpret this for you and tell you how I read it, that also has my bias in it, so it's always good to read it yourselves, or also to question if what I'm telling you is the best explanation for the things we're reading. So why don't we go ahead now and look at a video. A couple years ago was the 100th anniversary of Einstein's E equals mc squared. And so this is a little news video of that tells you a little bit about Einstein, and also it tries to explain the physics concept. I mentioned another famous thing that he discovered was that time is not linear, that gravity affects time. And this invention actually is what allowed GPS, the thing we use on our cell phones to know where we are. They have to account for the fact that time shifts through space and gravity. And so that's why some people think you might someday be able to time travel, or use this bend in time to show that time is not evenly paced through life. So it's quite an interesting concept in physics. So let's go ahead and look at this video, and one thing this video does is it kind of it explains that concept pretty well. And I'm definitely, you can tell I'm not a scientist person, but I think it's quite interesting. So let's go ahead and have a look.
On this date, exactly 100 years ago, a relatively unknown German physicist published a theory that would forever change the way we understand space, time, and matter. It's why you recognize Albert Einstein's face 60 years after his death. But it's probably not the equation you're thinking of.
E is equal mc squared.
That's his special theory of relativity, the one we see on T-shirts and posters and in so many other places. It's important too, but 10 years after he knocked that one off came a much bigger revelation. It was 1915, the First World War had just begun, and Einstein was living in Germany. According to his wife Elsa, he became lost in thought one day, sat down at his piano and started playing, then headed upstairs to his study, where he remained for 2 weeks, only eating when she brought him food. When he finally came back down, he had this, his general theory of relativity.
Mass and energy are.
In a nutshell, the geometry explains that space and time can be bent by matter, like stars and planets. The theory was revolutionary, won him worldwide acclaim, led to his move to the United States, and eventually to status in pop culture never achieved by any other scientist in the world. So, is Einstein relevant today? Our national science correspondent, Bob McDonald, joins us with his take on relativity. Bob, is Einstein's theory still a big deal?
Oh, it is, Peter. No one's been able to prove him wrong in all of this time. We see his effects everywhere in the universe. And to just give you an idea of how differently he thought of gravity, Newton, famous for gravity in his apple, thought of gravity as a force, the earth pulling an apple down and the apple pulling the earth up. But Einstein saw it like this. If I put Newton's apple on this flat piece of plastic, if it stays there, you can see that it makes a dent. That's how Einstein saw space. He saw it as flexible. And if I take another object and put it close to that, it will be attracted to it. It'll go down the gravity well, and if I was really good, I could make it actually orbit around. So he saw space as flexible, as a curvature. And the more massive the object I put on here, the deeper down it will go. And if I put something really heavy, it'll go right through. And that would be a black hole where you can't get out at all. So thanks to Einstein, we understand things like black holes, neutron stars, even the beginning of the universe itself. Newton works on the local scale, like here. Einstein tells you about the rest of the universe.
So are there any practical applications for us?
Well, I guess the most practical one is GPS satellites. They're moving around the Earth and they depend on very, very precise time, and their clocks actually run slower in space thanks to Einstein's relativity. And of course, those big particles accelerators like the Large Hadron Collider, when they speed things up, they gain mass. So Einstein just keeps being proven right again and again. A remarkable theory.
All right, Bob, thanks very much. Bob McDonald,
Okay,
he's in Victoria this evening.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video.